So police forces in the UK have been accused of being racist by prioritising applicants from minority groups over white British applicants. So I've obviously had a number of comments and questions and emails about covering this. I have covered things like this before, but I would like to do that again in direct response to this latest news. And there are a couple of scenarios in which this might well be discriminatory, but it really depends on precisely how they implement it. So I'll go through that in this video. But first of all, about half of you don't subscribe to the channel. I'd be really grateful if you did, even if it annoys one or two people when I ask. I do ask because that's how YouTube works. So apologies for those that get fed up of it, but that just helps. So if ever you want to grow a YouTube channel, that really does help. So thank you for doing that. Uncharacteristically for me, I've got some notes with me because obviously I don't have my laptop sitting out here in the middle of nowhere in China, but here we go. Let's have a look at this. So the Equality Act. Now this is the first bugbear that I'll talk about because a lot of people, when they talk and they try to talk with some authority on this and they call it the Equalities Act, really quite annoys me. Now it's a simple mistake. I won't be overly critical about it, but it does annoy me if someone wants to speak with authority about it and they don't get the name of the act right. It's the Equality Act 2010. Now the Equality Act is designed primarily for companies and employers and governments, etc., not to discriminate against anybody with a protected characteristic, most of which you'll obviously be familiar with: age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage, civil partnership, sexual orientation, race, religion, belief, etc. And so if anyone is discriminated against, that is to say they are treated less favorably, directly or indirectly, because of one of those protected characteristics, then they are unlawfully discriminating against somebody. Now I say unlawfully discriminating against somebody because there is lawful and unlawful discrimination. For example, there are certain provisions for men and certain provisions for women that are different, and that is directly because of being male or female. This is one of the reasons I have an issue with gender reassignment and all of this sort of stuff, because when these two things overlap, it can cause problems. For example, sex is immutable, in my opinion. You are either male or female, and whereas gender reassignment is different entirely. It is a gender identity, and thus if you were discriminated against specifically because of your gender identity, that is a different matter. But back to the point here, this is whether or not the police force is discriminatory on the basis of race, with regard to its application procedure. So an employer can lawfully discriminate to an extent during its application process if it is taking steps, reasonable measures to address an underrepresentation or a disadvantage which is experienced or evident within a particular group with a protected characteristic. So if in this scenario here, there is an underrepresented group of society within the application process, or indeed within the employment of the company or the force as a whole, they can take specific steps and measures so long as they're proportionate to address that disparity. However, the way in which it does so will determine whether or not it is discriminatory. So under section 158, that is general positive action of the Equality Act, whereas section 159 is with regard to recruitment and promotion, these sections allow for positive action, that is to say they take a specific step towards helping or addressing a particular group, so long as it is objectively justified. Now, what does that mean? Well, there must be evidence of some, first of all, underrepresentation or disadvantage, which includes the data and the statistics, etc., that shows that one particular group or of the workforce or whatever is underrepresented or disadvantaged in some way or another. They then must show that whatever positive action or step that they take is a proportionate means of addressing this issue. And so it must be appropriate, necessary, proportionate, and without excessively harming any other group. So for example, which is how I saw it reported, which I don't think is exactly how it's been implemented, but it's how I saw it reported. For example, if the force were to say, we are not employing any white British candidates for the next year or two to address this problem, that would be excessively harming that particular group because they're white British. That would pretty much certainly be discriminatory and unlawful, and not a proportionate step under these sections as permitted to address any disparity. However, if these steps were much less severe, for example, they just gave minority groups a little bit of a head start, a little bit of assistance, and thus helped to address this disparity, that might be a different story altogether. So just to be clear, what this positive action does not permit is any kind of blanket exclusion, blanket restriction, or any other extreme measure that would in and of itself be discriminatory and excessively harming any other group as a result of trying to assist one group. And so therefore we come to this balancing act of being proportionate and justified in any step that they take. Otherwise, there is a risk of direct discrimination against said group.
Taking a step back for a moment, if you've watched my channel for any length of time, you'll have noticed that recently I've taken an interest in news and politics and how, together with the law, they overlap and intertwine and affect your everyday lives. But one thing that interests me the most is the headlines. Not just because you may not know everything about a story and so you're looking for the detail, but how they can be very different depending on the political leanings of the outlet, whether they are left or right-leaning outlets, and they focus on different details altogether. And in essence then, giving you a different spin on the same story. So if you didn't know the facts, you learn the facts from that outlet, and then they can influence you, or in some cases mislead you, into what to think. Take, for example, the hugely controversial UK deal with regard to the Chagos Islands and Mauritius. And so as a hugely simplified explanation, first of all, in 2019, the International Court of Justice ruled that the separation of the Chagos Islands from Mauritius was unlawful, and that the UK had an obligation to end its administration of the islands. Now, bearing that in mind, let's take a look at some of the headlines, because I use Ground News to look at the left and the right headlines to draw a comparison between the two. In fact, it even has a biased comparison on the website, with the left-leaning outlets focusing very much more on the historical context, the decolonisation, and the international legal rulings in favour of Mauritius, whereas the right-leaning outlets emphasise very much more that this is a surrender of sovereign territory and the cost implications, which will run to many billions of pounds as a cost to the taxpayer. So let's take a look at some of those headlines and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. If we look at the Colorado politics, it says Trump approves the UK plan to give up the Chagos Islands under the ICJ's decolonisation ruling. ABC News says UK and Mauritius close in on a deal over the Chagos Islands after US signals its consent. And the Daily Mirror says Trump gives UK Chagos Islands decision that will silence Nigel Farage. Comparing this with some of the more right-leaning outlets, we have the Sun headline, Fury as Trump signs off PM's Chagos Islands deal set to cost Brits billions. GB News went with Donald Trump signs off on Keir Starmer's Chagos surrender, but Labour refuses to come clean on the true cost to Britons. And the Daily Express went with Nigel Farage loses it over Chagos surrender as Donald Trump signs off the deal. And so with headlines so different, you might wonder whether you're really getting the true picture. And so that is why I partner with Ground News, which is both an app and a website which pulls together news from around the world and gives you this bias comparison. It gives you a factuality score to determine how accurate the news source is that you're reading, and even an indication as to ownership, because that can give a clue as to why the headlines lean a certain way. And of course, there are always some stories that are disproportionately covered by the left or the right, and that is precisely why Ground News has a blind spot feature, which will highlight to you the stories that are disproportionately covered by the left or the right to ensure that you get the full picture. And as always, as a partner to my channel, you get a fantastic discount, which is 40% off. That's 40% off using the link ground.news/BBB, which is on screen and in the description below, to get you 40% off access to the world's news. And so the next time you're reading a story and you're wondering if it's just a little bit biased, you can check on Ground News and you can get the full picture and see another side to the same story. So grab yourself the discount with the link in the description below and stay on top of the world's news.
And so now let's address what West Yorkshire Police have been accused of and what their statement was and whether or not we think that is discriminatory on that basis. Well, West Yorkshire Police said you may have seen articles in the national media suggesting that West Yorkshire Police is blocking or even rejecting white British applicants from the recruitment process. They say that this story originated from a query from the Telegraph regarding the force's approach to positive action. The full response sent earlier in the week was as follows, and this is reading from the West Yorkshire Police website, which I can link below. They say, in West Yorkshire Police, we are committed to improving equality, diversity, inclusion within the organisation and strive to be more representative of the communities we serve. Our diversity, equality, inclusion team supports and consults with those of different protected characteristics such as sex, disability, sexual orientation and race to ensure that their views can influence and improve the service the force delivers. They also work to improve the well-being of everybody in the organisation and inclusivity overall. The most recent census, they say, found that 23% of people in West Yorkshire identified as being from an ethnic minority background. Our current police officer representation from ethnic minority background is around 9%. So, to be clear, they say that roughly 23% of the people within West Yorkshire identify as one of a number of ethnic minority backgrounds, but only 9% were reflected within the police force. To address this underrepresentation, they say we use positive action under the Equality Act. They got it right. Our use of this was recently reviewed under His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services in an activism and impartiality inspection, and no issues were identified. And so then we get on to what they actually did. They say positive action allows people from an underrepresented group who express an interest in joining the force to complete an application, which is then held on file until a recruitment window is opened. They say no interviews are held until the window is officially open to all candidates. Enabling people from underrepresented groups to apply early does not give them an advantage in the application process. It simply provides us with more opportunity to attract talent from this pool of applicants. But that is where the statement ends, and that is where I have a little bit of a question to raise, because whilst they might have addressed the issue at hand to allay any concerns that it's discriminatory, etc. The follow-up question would then be, how does the recruitment process itself ensure that the early application bears no bearing on success? Now, the only way to do that fairly would be to do a blind application process without any idea at all that the candidate was from an ethnic minority background. Now, obviously, because it does, bits of the application and recruitment process include face-to-face sections, fitness sections, etc. It's impossible to entirely rule out whether somebody is from an ethnic minority background. Whether or not the early application has any bearing on that at all is another matter. This would obviously then come down to the personnel actually running the recruitment, making the assessments, and determining whether or not the candidate is suitable for the job. Now, assuming that the application and the recruitment process is rigorous and entirely fair, in other words, there's no different criteria or pass threshold via fitness tests or anything else of that nature, then if everything else is equal, then that should be perfectly fine. But nothing is perfect, and thus it would eventually come down to an individual case as to whether somebody believed they were discriminated against. So it's unlikely in that scenario. And so assuming that the only positive action that they've taken is to allow them to apply early, then there's an argument that it's a proportionate step to achieve a legitimate aim. However, the problem then comes that they may then have actively blocked applicants from a white British background, which conversely may end up being discriminatory. So on the whole, I think what the positive action should be is to extend the application period rather than allow them to apply early. Because the argument thus would be, if they make the application period longer, which is the broad effect of what they're doing, if you say for a moment, here is where the applications are accepted and here is where the recruitment process begins, that period is where they are accepting those applications from those minority groups. I can't really see any difference from accepting all applications but just extending that period. Because otherwise, if they say that it's not satisfactory to accept white British applicants in that longer period, because then effectively what they would be doing would be admitting that accepting all of them would be discriminatory against the minority group because they've accepted all applications. Whereas if the recruitment process itself was fair, notwithstanding the applications, if the recruitment and the actual process itself was fair, then surely there's no discrimination. So I just think they should extend the recruitment period as the positive action to enable applicants of a minority background to apply earlier and to apply for longer, therefore more likely to attract their attention. Because I don't see the connection. I cannot get past this. I cannot see the connection between blocking white British applicants and only allowing those of a minority background to apply early, because they will still apply. What they can do as the positive action is take positive steps to encourage them to apply, to visit certain centres or certain regions of the city, to visit them in person, to go with billboards, go with a van driving around with recruitment leaflets, and hold events to encourage them to apply to the force. That would be positive action. That would be encouraging them to apply. Extending the application period would be giving them more opportunity to apply. But excluding white British applicants during that period, personally and as a lawyer, I think that is very likely discriminatory. And I think there are better ways around it which are far less likely to be discriminatory against white British applicants. That is just my view. You're welcome to disagree with it, but please do let me know what you think in the comments below. But I thought I'd give you a little bit of a talk on this. I know I've talked about it before, but it keeps popping up and these questions keep coming up again and again. And unless it's addressed, I fear it will only get worse. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.